The dinner had been Lady Dorothea's idea, which meant it was not a dinner at all. It was a proceeding. Cecily sat at the long table in the Marlowe dining room and kept her hands folded in her lap and counted the candles, because counting was something to do with her mind that was not listening to what Reginald Follett was saying at the head of the table. He had taken the head of the table. He had taken it as though it were already his, as though the 8 months remaining on the Court of Chancery's deliberation were a mere formality, as though the matter of Sir Edmund Marlowe's estate had been settled in the Follett family's favor some time before any of them had sat down to their soup. There were 12 other guests at the table: Mrs. Pembury from the village, the Reverend Holcott and his wife, Colonel and Mrs. Slade, the young Haverfield daughters, with their mother. Cecily had watched Lady Dorothea place them all, with the precision of a tactician, the witnesses arranged at equal distances from the spectacle, so that none of them could miss it, and all of them would carry the verdict home. The verdict was simple. Follett would speak. He would speak as the inheritor speaks, in the first person possessive, about the estate, about the tenants, about the east field that needed draining, about his very particular plans for the timber. And Cecily would sit at the far end of the table and be still. She had become very good at being still. She had concluded in the 2 years since Edmund's death, the only skill her position permitted. She was still when Follett paused at the mention of the disputed documents. She was still when Lady Dorothea touched her fan to her wrist in the manner that meant not now. She was still when she heard the door at the far end of the room open, and the footman's murmured announcement. And she was still when she looked up and saw for the first time the man who had been appointed by the Court of Chancery to review the matter of the Marlowe estate. He was not what she had expected. She did not know precisely what she had expected. Someone older, perhaps. Someone more like a document. Callum Deverell was 34, and stood in the doorway of the Marlowe dining room as though he had not hurried and had not meant to hurry. Dark-haired, composed to a degree that read almost as indifference, his eyes moving across the assembled company with a measuring quality that was not exactly cold. It was more like a man who had learned to see clearly and had decided that clarity was the only thing worth practicing. He settled his gaze on her last. Not long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Long enough that she felt it in the region of her collarbone, a small, unwelcome awareness. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Dorothea said from across the table, in the voice she reserved for corrections. "My late son's wife has kept her own name. For the present. She is Mrs. Cecily Marlowe," and from beside the Dowager Reginald Follett smiled. She had been Mrs. Cecily Marlowe for 2 years and 4 months. Cicely, Tobling. She had been Cecily Hartwell for 22 years before that, the daughter of Reverend James Hartwell of Little Stanton, Wiltshire, who had loved his books and his God in roughly equal measure, and who had seen no reason whatsoever that his only daughter should not love both alongside him. Greek first, because it was the language of the Testament. Then Latin, because it was the language of the law and the church and every document that had ever tried to tell a woman what she could not have. He had begun when she was 8 and had continued until she was 17, and he died of a chill in January that he could not afford to call a physician for. She had married Edmund Marlowe 8 months later. She had not married him for love, which was not shameful in 1809. She had married him because the alternative was the Caldwell family in the next parish, who had 4 daughters and no room for a 5th, and because Edmund was not unkind. He was not unkind. He simply preferred her quiet. He preferred her domestic and pleasant, and without opinions on anything he might have formed an opinion on first. The Latin she did not mention. She had learned quickly enough that her opinions were not wanted, and opinions expressed in a classical language that one's husband had not studied were opinions compounded by embarrassment. He had told her once, in the 3rd year of their marriage, when she had tried to show him a passage from a letter his old tutor had sent, and she had rendered for his convenience, that he did not require her to translate for him, and that her efforts were, in his view, an affectation and an embarrassment to us both. She had set the letter down. She had not reached for Latin again in his presence. She had not reached for it at all in the 2 years since his death. The Marlowe estate, which she had come to as a bride and in which she had spent 8 years as a wife and 2 as a widow, was a substantial property in Derbyshire, with 4 tenant farms, a respectable library, and a locked chest in the late baronet's study. The chest was of dark oak, banded in iron. Sir Edmund had kept the key on his person, always, in a small pocket inside his waistcoat. When he died, Lady Dorothea had been in the room before the physician had left it. What she had taken from the body was not spoken of. The key was simply gone, and the chest remained locked. And when Cecily had asked about it in the weeks following the funeral, Lady Dorothea had told her that Edmund's private correspondence was no concern of his widow's, and that the chest would remain sealed pending the settlement of the estate. The settlement, according to the documents Lady Dorothea had produced 6 weeks after Edmund's death, was entirely in favor of the cousin, Follett. Cecily had not seen Edmund write those documents. She had not known, in his lifetime, that he intended to leave the estate from her. Well, the Marlowe solicitor had explained, with the particular gentleness men reserve for women they expect not to argue, that Sir Edmund had apparently revised his testament in the final months of his illness, and that the new document superseded all prior arrangements. That Cecily had spoken with Edmund daily in those months, that she had read to him and brought him broth, and sat beside him through the long nights, that she did not recall any conversation about revising his will. None of this had seemed to the solicitor materially relevant. She had remained at Marlowe Hall because no one had yet asked her to leave, and because she had nowhere else to go, and because the chest was still in the study. Lord Ashmore arrived on a Tuesday, which in Derbyshire in November was a grey and wet day, without any romantic quality whatsoever. Cecily was in the corridor outside the library with a stack of estate ledgers. She had taken it upon herself to audit, because auditing them gave her something to do with her hands, and because no one had told her she could not when she heard the carriage on the gravel. She did not go to the door. She stood in the corridor and held the ledgers. He came through the house with the housekeeper, Nora Trench, and Cecily heard his voice before she saw him, low and level, asking about the condition of the east wing roof. A practical question. She had not expected a practical question. She had expected announcements. When he turned the corner and found her in the corridor, he stopped. She felt with some clarity that he had not expected her to be holding ledgers. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. "Was." His voice was the same at close range. Level, not warm, precisely, but not cold, either. Something more careful than either. "My lord," she said. He looked at the ledgers, he looked at her. He did not look in the direction of the study, though the study was behind her, and they both understood that the chest was the primary reason for his presence in Derbyshire. "I should like," he said, "to see the full run of the estate accounts beginning with the year before Sir Edmund's illness." She looked at him. She had not been asked about the accounts. She had not been asked about anything relevant to the estate since the solicitor's visit. "I have them," she said. Something shifted in his face. Something small. A slight recalibration. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of a thing he had already half suspected. He did not pursue it. He said good, and moved past her toward the study, and she felt the air in the corridor change in the wake of him, and made herself look at the wall until it changed back. She had not expected that. She had not expected to feel anything in particular about the executor of her late husband's estate. Over the days that followed, she grew careful about Lord Ashmore in the way she was careful about things she did not fully understand. He took meals with Lady Dorothea, who was gracious to him in the way she was gracious to people whose authority she intended to circumvent. He took long walks across the estate in the mornings, sometimes accompanied by Mr. Dant Croft, the London solicitor he had brought with him, who was 55 and mild and thorough in the manner of very good legal minds. He asked questions about the tenants. He asked questions about the timber rights. He asked, twice, about a parcel of land to the north that Cecily knew, from the ledgers had been attached to a private mortgage she had not been able to source. He did not ask her any of this. He asked the steward. He asked the housekeeper. he asked Follett, who answered in the expansive manner of a man who already considered himself the owner of the thing being asked about. He watched her, not persistently. Not in a way that was obvious or uncomfortable. He watched her the way a careful man watches something he cannot yet account for, and she was aware of it in a low and continuous way that she found it impossible to dismiss. The witnessing happened on a Thursday evening in November, 9 days after his arrival. Nora had come to her room the night before, her face composed in the particular way that meant she was frightened. Edmund, she said, had told her once, in good health, that he had set aside a small sum for her in his testament. He had named the specific amount, £60, and she had carried it in memory ever since. She had relied on this. She had mentioned it to no one, had told no one. It was promised. The New Testament, the one Lady Dorothea had produced, contained no such provision. Cecily had held Nora's hand for a moment. Then she had said, "Give me until morning." She went to the study, after midnight, when the house was quiet. The chest was locked. The documents on Edmund's desk were not. She had reviewed them before, but she had not reviewed them as she reviewed them now, methodically holding the candle close. There were 3 documents in Edmund's hand. 2 were in English. The third was not. Edmund had gone to Oxford. He had studied the classics. When he wished to say something plainly and without possibility of misunderstanding by the wrong parties, he had apparently written in Latin. She set the candle on the desk and sat down and read it. It was a letter, addressed to a solicitor in London named Ellison, and it was dated 3 months before Edmund's death, and it was a description, in Edmund's careful and slightly awkward Latin, of the arrangement he had made with his own testament. He named the chest, the key, the first will which named Cecily as sole inheritor, and the instruction that if anything should prevent the chest from being opened in a timely manner, Ellison should apply to the Court of Chancery. She read it twice, to be certain she had read it correctly. Then she heard the sound of a footstep in the doorway, and looked up, and Lord Ashmore was standing in the entrance to the study, with a candle of his own, and an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was that of a man who has seen something he did not entirely expect to see, and is deciding, with considerable speed, what to do about it. She did not attempt to conceal the document. She did not cover it, or look away. "My lord?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was rather surprised by how steady it was. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. A silence. "Not uncomfortable, something else." Something that had more weight than silence usually carried. "Edmund wrote to a solicitor named Ellison," she said. "In London, he wrote in Latin, which he did not imagine his family would be able to read. I have translated the relevant passage if you wish to hear it." Another silence. He crossed the room, and the candlelight moved with him, and he sat in the chair across the desk from her. And he said, "Please." She read the translation aloud slowly in the same measured way her father had taught her to read anything that mattered. The study was very still. Outside the window the Derbyshire night was black and windless, and the only sounds were the low creak of the old house settling, and the faint percussion of her own voice in the silence. When she finished, she set the page down. Lord Ashmore said nothing for a moment. She had expected questions, or the solicitor's instinct to verify, to cross-examine. He sat with his hands flat on the arms of the chair, and looked at the page she had set down as though it were a document in a case he had suspected all along. £60, he said at last, for the housekeeper. "Yes," Cecily said. "Nora Trench. She has been with this household for 30 years. She has trusted in that provision for nearly 2 of them. No one thought to ask her what she was owed." He looked at her. The candlelight was at an angle across his face, and in that light she could see the particular stillness that lived in him, the quality that was not coldness, but something more like containment. A man who held things inward, because outward had once somewhere cost him badly. "How long have you been able to read Latin?" he said. She did not want to answer. She answered, "Since I was 8 years old." He did not look surprised. He looked, she thought, like a man who finds a thing confirmed that he had privately been certain of for some time. "My father," she said, and then stopped, because she had not intended to explain herself. You need not account for it, he said. His voice was low, level. I am glad someone in this house can. He stood. He picked up his candle. He paused at the doorway. Lock the study when you leave, he said. I will speak with Ellison in London by post tomorrow morning. He left. She sat in the study for another quarter of an hour, the Latin letter in her hands, and the candle burning down, and her heart doing something methodical and inconvenient in her chest that she did not have language for in any tongue. If you have stayed this far, stay a little longer. What is late in Latin will not rest quiet much longer. The following morning she returned the ledgers she had been reviewing to the shelf in the library, and in the afternoon she found a note from Lord Ashmore on the small table outside her door. It contained 2 sentences. The first said that Ellison had confirmed the existence of a prior communication. The second said, in Lord Ashmore's level hand, please do not sign anything Lady Dorothea presents to you before speaking with me. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket, and carried it there all day, like a small, specific warmth. The note had arrived because something was moving. She could feel it in the quality of Lady Dorothea's attention at dinner, the way the older woman's eyes tracked her across the table, the studied composure she wore, the way she wore her most expensive jewels, as armor as much as ornament. Follett had been at Marlow Hall every day that week, and he and Lady Dorothea took long private conversations in the drawing-room with the door closed. On the 4th morning after the study, she encountered Lord Ashmore in the library. She had come for a volume of estate history, and he was there before her, standing at the window that faced north. And he was touching something in his breast pocket, just a small, brief gesture. One hand pressed flat against his chest, over the coat's inner pocket, and then withdrawn. He did not know she had come in. She crossed to the shelves as quietly as she could, and took the volume she had come for and was nearly at the door, when he said, without turning, There is a letter in my pocket from my sister Agnes. She died 11 years ago. She was 17, he said, still facing the window. I was 23. She wrote to me in the last good week, when she was not yet truly ill, or when I had persuaded myself she was not truly ill. The letter is the last thing she wrote. I should have gone for the physician 2 days before I did. The room was very quiet. The November light came gray through the window. She died of a fever, Cecily said. Not a question. She had understood it from the particular quality of his stillness. She did, he said. He turned then and looked at her. She had the volume of estate history in her hands and was not sure what to do with her face. So she let it be what it was, which was moved and rather afraid of being moved. I have made it my habit since, he said, not to delay when I know something. Not to wait for convenience. It seemed the only useful response to it. She thought of the note he had sent. She thought of the way he had sat in the opposite chair in the study at midnight and said simply, Please. I am sorry about Agnes, she said. He looked at her for a moment in the gray light. There was something in his eyes that had not been there before or that she had not seen before, a kind of openness that he usually kept considerably further from the surface. Then he said, Thank you, in a voice she had not heard him use, which was very quiet and entirely without the careful composure he put between himself and everything else. She left, before she stayed, which she was conscious was the wiser choice. The darkness came from 2 directions at once. The first was Nora, who came to Cecily's room on a Monday morning, with her cap slightly askew and her face the color of old linen. She closed the door behind her and stood with her back to it, and said that she had been in the corridor outside the morning room when Follett spoke to Lady Dorothea about the Court of Chancery's inquiry, and that Follett had said, exactly as he had said before, that there was no reason to credit anything the widow might claim, because she was a vicar's daughter who had played at learning, and that her understanding of any document related to the estate would be easily dismissed in any court, 3 times then. The 3rd time from a man who intended to put that assessment before a judge. Cecily sat with this information for a moment. She had known it was coming. She had known it, in the way you know a thing you have been carefully not knowing, because knowing it fully required doing something about it. The second darkness came in the afternoon, when Lady Dorothea appeared in Cecily's room, with a document in her hand, and Mr. Croft's counterpart, a local solicitor named Pruitt, at her shoulder. The document was a formal relinquishment, Cecily's voluntary surrender of any claim against the testament as presented. Lady Dorothea set it on the writing desk, with the quiet authority of a woman who has never been told no by anyone whose opinion she respects. "This would simplify matters considerably," Lady Dorothea said, "for everyone." Cecily looked at the document. She looked at Pruitt, who had the decency to look at the ceiling. "I understand," she said. "I am glad," Lady Dorothea said. "I will not sign it," Cecily said. The silence after this was of an entirely different quality than any silence that had preceded it in that room. Lady Dorothea looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The expression of a woman whose script had worked in every room it had ever been performed in, and was confronted, for the first time, with a room that was following a different text. "Mrs. Marlowe," she said, "you have very little ground to stand on." "I have Edmund's letter," Cecily said, "written in Latin, to Ellison in London. I am the only person in this house who could read it, and I have read it. And Lord Ashmore has confirmed its contents with Ellison directly. I will not sign." She kept her hands very still in her lap. She kept her voice level. She thought of her father at his desk in Little Stanton, his finger moving along the line of text, his voice reading the words first, and then waiting while she tried them, patient and grave and certain of her. More certain than anyone had been since. Lady Dorothea left without another word. Pruitt followed her. The door closed. Cecily sat at the writing desk for a long time. Then she picked up Edmund's Latin letter, which she had kept in her own possession since the night in the study, and she went to find Lord Ashmore. He was not in the library. He was in the steward's room with Mr. Plidd, Croft and 2 ledgers, and a map of the northern parcel. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he read her face in the way he had apparently learned to read things quickly, in the way a man reads things when he has decided that delay is the one luxury he cannot afford. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She placed the Latin letter on the map between them, and told him about Nora's report of what Follett had said that morning, and about Lady Dorothea's relinquishment, and about her refusal. Mr. Croft looked at the Latin letter. Lord Ashmore did not look at the letter, he looked at her. "Follett has invited the neighborhood to dine here Friday evening," she said. "He intends to announce his intention to proceed as inheritor." "Yes," Lord Ashmore said. "I know. He will say what he said to Lady Dorothea. He will say, 'I played at learning.' He will say, 'My reading of the document cannot be credited.'" "Yes," Lord Ashmore said. "He will try." She looked at him. He held her gaze, without flinching. "Will you let me speak?" she said. "At dinner, will you let me read it aloud? Before the company with your authority behind it?" Something crossed his face. Something she had seen only twice before. That openness surfacing from beneath the composure ungoverned for just a moment. "I will stand beside you while you do it," he said. "And Mr. Croft will confirm the provenance. Whatever Follett says about a vicar's daughter, the document will speak first." She nodded. She picked up the letter. "My father would have liked you," she said. She had not meant to say it. It was true, and she had not meant to say it, and she was already turning for the door when she said it, which was perhaps why it came out at all. She did not look back. She heard him say nothing, which was different from having nothing to say, and she felt the difference between them all the way down the corridor. Friday arrived in the particular way of evenings designed by Lady Dorothea. The candles were placed at their most flattering angles, the silver polished to a high gleam. The Haverfield daughters, and Mrs. Pembury and the Reverend Holcott, and the Slades and 6 others arranged at the dining table in the order most likely to produce the correct impression of consensus. Follett sat at the head. Lady Dorothea sat at his right. Or Cecily sat near the middle of the table between Mrs. Slade and the Reverend Holcott, with Lord Ashmore across from her and slightly to her left, and Mr. Nanning, Croft at the table's end with a leather case at his feet that contained a copy of the correspondence from Ellison in London confirming the first will's existence and the chest's contents. The soup was consumed. The fish followed. Follett drank 2 glasses of claret and spoke warmly about his intentions for the spring planting. When the 3rd course was laid, he rose. He spoke for 4 minutes. Cecily counted. He spoke about the estate, and about the Marlowe family's distinguished history, and about the burden of stewardship, and about the very simple, very unfortunate circumstances of the late baronet's widow, who had, through no fault of her own, been under a misapprehension regarding certain documents. Mrs. Marlowe, he said, with the particular gentleness that men reserve for dismissals, is to be commended for her dignity throughout this process. She is a vicar's daughter who played at learning, and it is not her fault that she believed herself capable of interpreting a legal document in a classical language. These are matters best left to those trained to assess them. He sat down. The Haverfield daughters looked at their plates. Mrs. Pembury looked at the wall. Reverend Holcott looked at Cecily. Cecily looked at Lord Ashmore. He looked back at her. He set his glass down. He rose. The room rearranged itself around him. It was not that he was loud, or that he made any gesture of authority. It was simply that he was who he was, and when a man of his rank rose in a room, rooms noticed. Follett, he said, has submitted that Mrs. Marlowe is not qualified to interpret classical Latin. He paused. 1 beat. 2. I should like to propose a demonstration. He looked at Cecily. She reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew the letter. She set it on the table in the candlelight so that the company could see that it was handwritten, that it was old, that it was real. She read it aloud. She read it in Latin first, slowly, clearly, the way her father had taught her, and then she read it in English the way Edmund had written it, plainly, without flourish, a man setting down what he knew in the only language he trusted to remain private. The chest, in the study. The key on his person. The first testament, naming his wife Cecily as sole inheritor. The request to Ellison that if anything impeded the chest's opening, Ellison should apply to Chancery. She read the date, 6 weeks before Edmund died, when she finished. The room was very still. Follett had risen partway from his chair. Lady Dorothea had not moved at all, which was, Cecily had come to understand, how Lady Dorothea responded to things she had not prepared for. She became perfectly still, like a figure in a painting, preserved without being alive. Croft opened his leather case and withdrew the letter from Ellison, and read from it, briefly. In his mild and thorough voice, Ellison confirmed receipt of the document. Ellison had confirmed the existence of the First Testament. Ellison had confirmed 2 days ago his intention to provide the Court of Chancery with a full account. Lord Ashmore looked at Follett. Mr. Follett, he said, has suggested that the estate's management should fall to him pending a review of the disputed documents. A pause. She has already done so. The estate is hers. 9 words. Level, without decoration. The kind of sentence that closes. Rooms. The Reverend Holcott said very quietly, "Here, here," and Mrs. Slade pressed her handkerchief to her lips, and from the far end of the table one of the Haverfield daughters made a small sound that was not quite a word. Follett sat down. He did not speak again. Lady Dorothea sat with her fan in her hand and her posture perfect. She looked in the candlelight, like someone who had just understood the shape of what had not gone as planned, and who was working out with considerable effort whether there was anything left to say. There was not. She closed her fan. Lord Ashmore looked at Cecily. She met his eyes. She did not permit herself to do anything with her face that the room would see, but in that look across the table, in the candlelight that flickered between them, she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, and she let him see that she felt it. Just for a moment. Just that. Then she folded Edmund's letter, and put it back in her pocket and picked up her glass. The chest was opened the following morning. Mr. Shenvi. Croft had written to the Court of Chancery the previous evening, and by mid-morning a locksmith from the village had been engaged, and by noon the lock had yielded to a tool that was not a key at all, because the key itself was still missing. And it did not matter any longer. The First Testament was inside, and £60 designated for the housekeeper, and a set of deeds and a handwritten note from Edmund in English. It said simply, "If Cecily is reading this, she will have found a way. She always does." Cecily read this line standing in the study with Mr. Brea, Croft beside her and Nora at the door, and she felt something very specific move through her, which was not entirely grief and not entirely vindication, but was something of both, and something else that had no clean name, a recognition of what Edmund had understood about her in the end that he had not known how to say while he was living. Nora received her £60 that afternoon, in cash from Mr. Croft's own pocket, pending the estate's formal settlement. She wept in the kitchen in the particular way of women who had been holding something in for a long time and had only now been given leave to set it down. The settlement was formally confirmed by the Court of Chancery 6 weeks later, in January, and by that time Lord Ashmore had come and gone twice from Marlow Hall, the first departure swift and the first return swifter, and on the occasion of the return he had brought with him along with Mr. Bassett Croft's final papers, a small pressed flower from a garden in Wiltshire, that he offered to Cecily with no explanation beyond the fact that he had stopped at Little Stanton on his way north and had spoken with the current occupant of her father's old house. She looked at the flower. She looked at him. "Feverfew," she said. "My father grew it along the south wall." "The new man keeps it still," Lord Ashmore said. He said the previous vicar's daughter had named it for him when she was very small, and he had not wanted to pull it up. She stood in the doorway of Marlow Hall, with a pressed flower in her hand, and felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time, not all at once, carefully. The way you open a door that you are not entirely certain of, that might be stuck, that might resist, that might need patience. The January evening was cold and clear, and behind her the hall was lit, and she could hear Nora somewhere in the kitchen, and the sound of the fire in the great room. In front of her was the gravel and the bare trees, and Lord Ashmore, who was looking at her with an expression she had learned to read over these weeks, which was not warmth exactly because he did not do warmth in the easy way, but was something more specific, something that saw her clearly. "From here. My father taught me Latin," she said, "because he wanted me to have something no one could take from me. Even if everything else was taken," he said, "the words would stay." "He was right," Lord Ashmore said. "Yes," she said he was. He stepped a little closer. "Not a great deal enough." She felt the cold air between them and the warmth that was specific to his presence, the quality she had been careful about for weeks, because being careful was how she had survived everything that had come before. She was tired of careful. She was very specifically and suddenly tired of careful. "I have been thinking," he said, "about Agnes." She waited. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have liked someone who reads Latin at midnight and tells dowager countesses no without raising her voice." She felt something move through her that was not grief, and was not the particular loneliness of the past 2 years, but was something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense of being seen clearly, without apology, by someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Lord Ashmore," she said, "you did not stop at Little Stanton on your way north because of the flowers." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I did not." The distance between them was small, and the evening was cold and the hall was lit behind her, and she thought of her father reading beside his lamp in Wiltshire, his finger on the line, his voice steady, the words coming first in Latin and then in the plain English that meant the same thing, the same truth, said 2 ways so that it would hold. She took 1 step forward. He did not move. He watched her, very still. And she felt his attention the way you feel a fire from 3 feet away, even when you are not yet touching it. "Cecily," he said. Her name? Her given name? The first time he had used it, he said it the way her father had said the most important words. Not quickly, but exactly right. Her hand was cold. His hand was warm when he took it, gloved palm to gloved palm in the frost of the January evening, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and the pressed flower was still in her other hand, and the hall was lit, and the fire was going, and Nora was somewhere inside and the kitchen smelled of bread. She thought of a chest opened after a long time in darkness. She thought of what was found inside it. Not treasure, exactly, but truth. Words in a dead man's hand that had waited in good faith. £60 for an old woman who had trusted in them, and a name written plainly. Cecily. She always does. She had always done it alone. She was not going to have to anymore. By the following spring, the feverfew was growing along the south wall of Marlow Hall. Cecily had brought the cutting herself from Little Stanton in February, when Lord Ashmore drove her there for the first time as a married woman, so that she could see the old house and walk the path beside the church where her father had walked in the evenings, and stand for a moment in the churchyard with her husband at the stone that had his name on it. The cutting had taken well in the Derbyshire soil. It grew in a yellow-white fringe along the old stone wall, the sort of plant that does not ask for much and does not stop once it has started. And Nora had taken it under her particular care. In the study that had been Edmund's, on the desk that Cecily now used for the estate's accounts, the locked chest sat open. She kept it that way. She kept the First Testament inside it, and Edmund's note, and the small folded paper she had found tucked beneath the deeds, which turned out to be a letter from Agnes Deverell, 17 years old, and writing to her brother in a neat, round hand from a house in Shropshire, where she had been visiting and where she had, she said, met the most interesting woman of Vicaire Blank, her wife, who had read her a passage of Virgil over tea, and who had made her think that the world was larger than she had been led to believe. Lord Ashmore had not known this letter was in the chest. Edmund, it seemed, had corresponded briefly with Agnes in her last months. Agnes had written back, the letter had arrived after her death, forwarded by the host family, and Edmund had kept it without knowing what to do with it. Cecily had read it aloud to her husband on the evening she found it, standing in the study doorway, with the candle in her hand. He had not spoken for a long time afterward. Then he had come to the doorway where she stood, and taken the letter from her hands and folded it very carefully in the way he folded the one he already carried, and placed it in his breast pocket beside it. 2 letters now, she said. 2 letters, he said. Yes, the fire was going in the great room. Outside the study window, the January had gone over into March, and the light was coming back to the Derbyshire hills in that particular way, pale and tentative and slowly certain, the way light always does come back, in the end, after the long dark. She set the candle on the desk and went to him. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below. It costs nothing, and means a great deal.